Welcome back, Vintage Gamers, to a special video here. I decided that enough is enough. It's time we really broke it down and talked about everybody's favorite or least favorite new Magic card. Can you even say new Magic card? It's been a year and a half. New Magic card, Urza Saga. This card is definitely making waves in the Vintage community as it is a format-defining card. It is extremely powerful, and the deck building constraints in Vintage and the card pool in Vintage end up making this card more powerful than it is in any other format. As with all new cards that are extremely powerful, it's even been talked about as being, a possible restriction candidate. There have been a variety of extremely powerful Tinker decks that feature this card as either a main plan or a sub plan. And it is something that if you are deck building in Vintage, you have to be cognizant of. You have to have a plan on how you're going to address this card, just like you have to have a plan on how you're going to address Doomsday, how you're going to address Bazaar of Baghdad, Mishra's Workshop. So obviously in quite powerful company here. So the point of this video is not to say Saga is good, Saga is bad. What we're going to do is a comprehensive overview of the card. I want to talk about why it's good, why it's bad. I want to talk about how it's used in Vintage. I want to talk about where it's used in Vintage. I want to talk about what decks are doing to combat this card. It's also, like a mechanically complex card where we want to talk about tips and tricks on, getting the most of it or abusing timing windows. So there's a lot to talk about, and that's what the aim of today is. Just talk about Urza Saga, and I want to talk about everything that I can about Urza Saga. So we're going to just start off with very basic, what does this card do for anyone who may be out of the loop? This card is a Saga, which is, a fairly new type of enchantment that is ephemeral. It's going to tell a story and then go away. And so it's very important to recognize that this is an enchantment, one, and it is a land, two. And once you introduce more types onto a card, it introduces more cards in the card pool that interact with it. So when this land comes into battlefield, so you're going to be your land drop for the turn, your first land drop for the turn. Most of the time, you're only going to have one land drop a turn. This is going to be it. It has no text when it enters the battlefield. Nothing. This actually is pretty important for something like Legacy, where you can't play this card in a deck with Zerda as a companion because it actually has no abilities. A trigger goes on the stack, and you will gain the first ability, tap, make a colorless mana. So now that ability is resolved, you can make mana with your land. On the next turn, when you draw a card, after you draw a card, you'll get another trigger, and you'll read the second chapter. And finishing that trigger is going to grant your Saga the ability to make 0/0 colorless artifact creatures that have +1/+1 for each artifact you control. That cost is tapping the land and 2 other mana. This is relatively strong on its own, right? If you make just a construct with this and then another construct and then an artifact that you search up, it's going to be, 2 3/3s. That's a lot of power off of a land. It's actually more than most creature producing lands you'll find in the history of Magic. But this starts to compound and become extremely powerful in a format like Vintage, where a lot of mana is actually not in lands, it's in Moxen, it's in artifacts, it's in Soul Ring, it's in Mana Crypt and Mana Vault. And so when you start to have all of your extra mana sources in lands, not only do your artifact creatures get stronger, but you're going to have that 2 colorless far quicker and far often. On turn 1, you could play a Saga, and realistically on turn 2, have 2 mana to tap and make a construct. Here's where things get tricky. I don't believe the designers wanted this to be the case, but due to you granting this ability on your Saga, on the third turn, in your upkeep and before you draw, you still have more time. And your Saga has untapped. So now you can tap and make a second construct. This is where I think the card starts to become a little less balanced than maybe intended. You have 2 constructs that are both pumping each other and getting bigger from the artifacts that you're searching. And that is where things get really tricky. So up until after you draw, when the third ability is going to go on the stack, your Saga will still be in play until the third ability, the third trigger resolves. So you have time there to draw a card, look at your card, activate an ability, and make another construct. Now, the final ability is search your library for an artifact card that costs exactly 0 or 1 generic. So this is important because it is pretty specific. You can't fetch an Arkham's Astrolabe, which costs 1 snow mana. You can't fetch a Chalice of the Void, which costs XX. You have to fetch exactly a 0 or a 1. Fortunately, in the vintage card pool, there are a lot of very powerful 0s and 1s. After that artifact gets put onto the battlefield, your Saga gets sacrificed and goes to the graveyard. All right, but that's just the basics. Let's get into the meat and potatoes here. What are vintage decks actually doing with Saga? And I basically went through all the lists, and I thought about, what is the purpose of Saga in this deck? What is Saga doing? Is it the whole game plan? Is it part of the game plan? Is it very much a standalone piece? Is it a piece that is adding on to other pieces? And I put them in basically 4 major categories. And now decks don't really fit into, one of these categories because they're all going to be doing this stuff to some degree. It's just like, how much are you doing it? Are you leaning into one of these 4 more than the other? And so the first thing is that obviously Urza Saga tutors for mana rocks. So it tutors for Moxen, it tutors for Soul Ring, Mana Vault, Mana Crypt. And this is, generically an artifact or a mana, but it also can be pushing towards, artifacts for PO or different other counts and different other objectives inside of your deck. It can also be searching for mana rocks of any color, right? So not only is your land, your land is colorless as it starts, but if it does complete its final chapter, it is going to get you a color. Maybe you need a splash color and you haven't found a fetch land or something of this variety. It can get you that Mox Sapphire or that Mox Ruby that you need. Secondly, it can tutor for combo pieces. The number one thing is it tutors for Manifold Key. Manifold Key combos with Time Vault to take infinite turns. This is extremely powerful because you don't want to run multiple Manifold Keys in your deck, and you can only run 1 Time Vault. So by getting to run, a number of Sagas, these also act as, extra copies of Manifold Key, which makes you more likely to establish a Vault Key combo. There are, of course, other combo pieces, things like Grindstone for Painter Grindstone, simply Black Lotus inside of Breach combo, and things like that. Secondly, you want to look at the constructs and what are the constructs doing in your deck, and they can be doing one of 2 things. They can be the standalone clocking game plan where you are making large constructs. They are not supported, they are supported by a large number of artifacts in your deck typically, but they are not supported by other aggro pieces. So you're thinking like Tinker Saga, right? That deck has a lot of artifacts in it, so these constructs are going to be large. They're going to be their own clock. And they're going to lean heavily into those. However, you can also go a different way and say, oh, I am doing, it could be a small clock or it could be a clock that is supplemental. So I am making artifact creatures to go with my already existing artifact creatures. Think about aggro shops, right? You have Nettle Cysts and Arcbound Ravagers and Foundry Inspectors, and you're attacking with artifact creatures. Now my land can make more artifact creatures when I run out of cards. Very, very powerful. So all these decks are doing some of this to some degree. Let's dive into each one individually. This is probably my favorite use of Saga in the format because I think it does something extremely unique and powerful. Breach decks get to use Saga as a way to search their combo piece, but their combo piece is a standalone broken card. And that's very unique. One of the best parts about Breach combo, for those who do not know, Underworld Breach, Black Lotus, and Brain Freeze, you mill your whole deck, and then you can mill your opponent's whole deck. Obviously, Black Lotus, broken magic card. So the fact that we get to combine the beginning of tutor for mana rocks and tutor for combo pieces, and then our combo piece is not a bad card on its own, is what I really like about Underworld Breach decks in their utilization of Saga. These decks, they do vary. There are two really schools of thought. One is to lean heavily on the artifact side. So you would see Sensei's Top, you would see Vault Key combo. And in that case, you really accelerate the idea of Underworld, of Urza Saga as a secondary beatdown plan. Or you can go the other way and forego all of the artifacts. You don't have to forego Tinker necessarily. You might still be able to tinker off of 5 Mox and Lotus and maybe 1 or 2 other artifacts. But you don't play these other cards like Sensei's Top or Volt Combo, and you are really primarily using your Saga as a tutor. So now, what's the upside of that? Well, Saga is an uncounterable tutor. It's not a tutor that is always going to resolve its story to completion. So there are countermeasures, but simply having Force of Will is not going to stop you from finding your Black Lotus, which is really, really powerful. So that's one of the biggest reasons I really like how Breach uses Saga. Breach doesn't always play 4 Saga. In fact, most of the time, I think it's playing around 3 Saga these days. Breach is a deck that does want colored sources. So playing your Saga has, an actual downside of you can't cast Preordain with your Saga. You can't cast Consider with your Saga, Pyroblast, Flusterstorm. So you don't want 4. Maybe you're playing turn 1 Preordain, turn 2, I'm going to leave open Flusterstorm, Pyroblast, Consider, and also I have this, Lotus Bloom, per se, Saga on Suspend, that's going to find my tutor piece to combo with later. Now, Breach uses Saga a little differently than, say, our next deck, which is these Tinker Saga decks is what we're calling them in the data sheet. So these are Esper Tinker, Grixis Tinker, you might see Grixis Hull Breacher. Basically, these decks are leaning heavily into Saga as a primary way to win the game. Now, these decks will always have Tinker Citadel, right? Tinker Citadel is the backbone, the most powerful thing that you're doing. However, this gives you a secondary, maybe not secondary, maybe a parallel, one might say, avenue of attack, right? You only get 1 Tinker, but you get 4 Saga. So these decks are using Saga as a primary beatdown plan and a primary combo plan. So you are playing a bunch of artifacts. You are playing Tinker for Citadel, but you also get to play Tinker for Vault Key combo. And your Urza Saga gets to find Vault Key. Well, gets to find the key part of Vault Key. And these Saga tokens are large because you are playing a full mana suite, full big blue mana suite. You're playing Mana Crypt, Soul Ring. And you are playing, more removal and controlling elements. You're playing Negation, you're playing Swords to Plowshares maybe, you're playing Prismatic Ending maybe, you're playing Hull Breachers maybe. And you are going to try to stop your opponent from doing as much of their game plan while creating, extremely large constructs to attack and win with. The upside of having this kind of large artifact suite in your deck is you also get to play the toolbox cards. So you're going to get to play maybe a Needle, a Top, and a Lantern all in the main. So your Saga doesn't immediately have to get, a Mana Rock or a Vault, a key. It can go get something that's going to prohibit your opponent's game plan, which is really powerful. Having access to Needle, which is probably the single best artifact hate piece for Bazaar of Baghdad, it's very, very powerful in the main. It's going to help you with those Bazaar matchups, which actually tend to be quite bad for this deck. There are some definitely difficulties facing Bazaar decks. So these are decks that are, unlike Breach, which is using Saga primarily as a way to supplement and make their main game plan work. This is using Saga as a main game plan. PO is a little different. It leans somewhere between the two, right? So PO decks that are using Saga are going to get a really nice benefit. It's very similar to the Black Lotus benefit of mana rocks that you find off of your Saga enable your paradoxical outcome. Now, they don't enable your paradoxical outcome to the same degree that Breach is enabled by Black Lotus, But being able to find Sapphire or Mana Crypt, even Mana Crypt is a really powerful mana rock for PO, or Opal. These kind of mana rock finds, mana fixing finds actually end up being a lot stronger because they are part of a combo or a synergy per se. These decks will, if they are playing Saga right, use the Vault Key as a combo as well, so you get that element. You can even run the Toolbox element. It's not necessary. You don't have to run them, but having additional, an additional needle and additional lantern in the main of a PO deck is going to give you a higher artifact count for Opal, which is important. Not to mention that the Saga tokens themselves enable Opal. And it's not really your primary plan. You'll definitely see PO pilots not make constructs because they're looking to do a combo thing. But if you're up against an opponent that is honed in on beating your combo, your spell-based elements, so think something like a Standstill opponent or a Jeskai opponent or a Maharu Oath opponent. They have a Mind Break Trap, a Flusterstorm, all of these. You probe their hand and it's 7 counterspells. You can actually make a lot of headway in just playing your land and making constructs and beating down. And that's something that I say a lot, right? When I talk about Saga and PO, I'm typically a proponent of a deck that doesn't have Saga in their PO deck. However, it's a tool that PO players should use. In my opinion, is that it's a tool PO players should use in metagames where players are leaning heavily into counterspells. So like PO historically has been a deck that is super powerful, but also answerable in the way that if you play a bunch of Pyroblast, you play a bunch of Flusterstorms, you can really just shut down PO's ability to play its powerful spells, and that's really rough. However, with the introduction of Saga into the format, you have an additional tool as the PO player to counter those kind of countermeasures for your combo plan, which is really important. It's not something to be slept on. I would never say PO decks should never play Saga. However, it's definitely going to be good in certain metagames, right? Now we're going to move on to outside of the blue decks and look at the colorless decks. So the colorless decks that play Saga are the 2 workshop decks. Aggro Shops kind of just throws Saga in the deck, right? It's not a focal point, but it's just a upgrade on things like Mistress Factory. Mistress Factory was the artifact creature land that the deck played prior to the printing of Saga. Now you get to, if you run out of gas, you can use your land to make some large constructs. There is some like push and pull there where you can't tap Mishra's Workshop to activate your Saga. So if you have like turn 1 Workshop, play all your artifacts, turn 2 Saga, and you don't have the requisite colorless mana like from an Ancient Tomb or from Moxen or from Soul Ring or whatever, it might be hard for you to make your construct, but that would be still true if you were playing Factory. I think the main thing that it really allows is for better usage of sideboard toolboxing. So things like Needle, Cage, Relic, Lantern are all kind of staples of Ravager or Aggro Shop sideboard. And this is going to let you get those with higher frequency, right? So being a Wasteland deck, you're going to Wasteland opponents' Bazaar of Baghdad, and then you can help shut down their ability to do graveyard-based shenanigans. It's also worth mentioning that some of these decks are playing a Ginger Brute, which is, a tutorable creature off of Saga, which can have haste and can wear a Nettle Cyst, and that could be, a potential way to like, oh, my board was Serenity. Not Serenity, that would be bad. Maybe my board was Shattering Screed, but the Shattering Screed couldn't hit the Saga, so the Saga went off. I get a Nettle Cyst, or sorry, I play a Nettle Cyst, I put it on a Ginger Brute, and I get the last points of damage, maybe even unblockable damage, right? So the Prison Shops decks are a little different, where Saga is actually a huge boon. These decks saw a huge surge immediately following the printing of Saga. Before the metagame kind of adapted to what Saga was doing, the decks that were easily slotted Saga in the best were Prison decks. And the reason is because the Prison deck's main problem at the time was it didn't really have a good way to kill you fast after it established its lock, right? You've got Crucible Wastelanded, there's Spheres, that kind of thing, Spheres and Thorns. I stopped you from doing spells, but if I stop you from doing spells for 10 turns, but on the 11th turn, you're still not dead, and you get out from underneath the lock, then it was all for nothing. And so what the Saga really does is it's a tutorable clock off of Golos, and you have a ton of artifacts in play, so these are huge creatures. It's going to end the game very quickly. So you get your lock, and then you make 2 big creatures, and you kill your opponent. Now, like, that hasn't worked as well when decks started to attack Saga in meaningful ways, and this kind of got hit by, like, the byproduct of that. But it's, it's a very sound philosophy to have your controlling prison deck have its clock in its land base. It works really well with Crucible, and the idea behind it is just like really, really synergistic, and that's why these decks had a really solid surge immediately after the printing. It's worth noting, of course, that this also lends to the prison outlook with the toolbox, getting cages and relics and that kind of thing to help stop your opponent from playing delve spells or doing whatever kind of shenanigans to get out of the lock. That can definitely be helpful. Also worth noting that sometimes it does play the Vault Key combo, so sometimes it is leaning on a combo element as well. Okay, I hinted about it, but there is a very legitimate reason why prison shops surged and then fell off after the printing of Saga, and that's because the metagame adapted. Format defining and is a term I like to use. People like to use format warping as a negative connotation, but a format is always going to warp around its most powerful cards, and Urza Saga is one of the most powerful cards. But people definitely learned in the months following the printing and the months of prison shops' rise how to attack this card and ways that your deck can gain advantages using the weaknesses of Saga. And so what I want to do is we want to just go through ways you can attack Saga, ways you can benefit from Saga, ways you can stop Saga. Those are all kind of intertwined, but it's worth pointing out that Saga itself is a very complex card in the fact that it has a lot of things going on. It has 2 types, it has 2 different abilities, I guess, and it has a tutorable, search effect. And all of these things have their own strengths and weaknesses. One of the most effective ways to counter Saga is, attacking it as a land. Obviously, the number one, component here is Wasteland. Wasteland is a card in 60% of vintage decks. Almost all fair decks at this point have to play Wasteland. And that's not just because of Saga, right? Bazaar of Baghdad is another really big component of forcing decks to have land-based interaction. It's just so powerful. Bazaar is so powerful that it needs to be addressed as fast as possible. And Saga is very similar in that regard. And so decks that have Wasteland have a way of time walking their opponent's turn. Now, the push and pull here ends up being, if you don't have a Wasteland in time, the constructs come out, and things get dicey. Now you have to answer the constructs and the Saga. And this is actually a very similar dynamic to Bazaar of Baghdad. If I draw a Wasteland a turn too late sometimes for Bazaar of Baghdad, they already put their Golgari Grave Troll in the graveyard. Things have already become problematic. There are, of course, other answers attacking as a land, like you play a Blood Moon or an Alpine Moon. Works very odd with Saga, where because of the way Sagas are worded, and it's not going to get its counter, and the Saga dies. I'm not an expert. I could look into the rules and find a better explanation for you, but basically know that if there's an Alpine Moon or a Blood Moon, your Saga is just going to go to the graveyard. So you even get to sidestep the downside of Blood Moon and Alpine Moon, where you're giving the opponent, the ability to make a red mana from a mountain or mana of any color from an Alpine Moon. Of course, it's also worth noting that Wasteland is a card that can be sequenced around. You can play cards, in different orders. You can play maybe your main deck Needle on Wasteland before you play your Saga. The timing windows on Wasteland are a little bit, there's room there to, get more value from your Saga than you normally would have if you play it correctly, that kind of thing. I think as a land is not as important as an enchantment. This is like the big glaring, in my mind, the big glaring weakness of Saga is that it is not just a land. Land is a historically hard type to interact with. If Urza Saga was just a land with like this vanishing thing, I think it would be so strong. It would probably be definitely within restriction level. But because it's an enchantment, there are many cards in Vintage card pool that interact with enchantments. The biggest one, of course, is Force of Vigor. Force of Vigor is going to deal splash damage as well, where you get to hit their land that they played for a turn. Now, let me also put that note in, is that you get to play one land drop a turn. If you use it as an Urza Saga and your Urza Saga gets destroyed, you've kind of lost the ability to use that land drop for a turn. You, of course, also lost the ability to use that land drop for a, colorful mana, blue spells, specifically Flusterstorm, Preordain, Pyroblast, that kind of thing. But it's definitely worth noting for Force of Vigor itself is that you're gonna, a lot of the times you're playing Saga, you're gonna play some artifacts to go along with it. At the very least, you're gonna play Moxen to go along with it. If you end up losing your Moxen and you lose your Saga, you've now lost 2 of your mana sources, and it can be hard to come back from that kind of thing. I included Pernicious Deed here just because it's more of a shout out to like how I attacked a Saga format. For those who don't know, I won a PTQ last year where I played an Oath of Druids deck that was a more controlling variety, and one of the key cards in attacking a metagame with lots of Saga was Pernicious Deed. Pernicious Deed doesn't have the rider that had of non-land on it. That's something you have to look for when you're looking at an enchantment removal. You need to make sure that it has non-land. So like something like Prismatic Ending, or doesn't have non-land, something like Prismatic Ending, you can't actually target a Saga, whereas something like March of the Otherworldly Light just targets an enchantment, so you're fine. So the nice part about something like Deed is it's going to hit the creatures that the land produced and the land itself. So it's going to hit Saga and the creature produced. And that's what makes it extremely powerful. Cards like Deed, cards like Serenity, which don't need to be played immediately, like Wasteland. Wasteland needs to be addressed immediately before constructs happen. Deed and Serenity are cards that can be addressed, or you can address Saga later on in the Saga's reading cycle. But that's not to say that cards that are just destroy target enchantment are not good. I really do believe that things like Wear Tear, Nature's Claim, March of the Otherworldly Light, cards that are single spell removal for enchantments are good against Saga. Having your opponent use their land drop for turn and having you answer it 1 for 1, and they don't have either their creature game plan or their tutor game plan or their the ability to make attackers is powerful, and something you should be on the lookout for. I think those cards kind of should have risen in priority, and I'm not sure that they have to the degree that I would think is correct. You can, instead of destroying Saga, answer what the Saga is doing from an activated ability standpoint. The best way to do this is obviously just turn off its activated abilities with the Needle. The Needle is just going to make it so that you don't get constructs. Now, opponent will still get to tutor. So you are only really stopping constructs, but maybe it kind of depends here on what is the way, how do I phrase this? It depends on what your deck cares about. Now, if your deck has a problem dealing with the constructs, then something like a Needle makes a lot of sense. If your deck has a problem dealing with the tutor, well, then maybe Needle isn't the best option. I put Collector Roof here because it's actually really a fascinating subject, because if you ask 2 people, they might tell you 1, Collector Roof is really good against Saga, or 2, Collector Roof is really bad against Saga. And the distinction actually just comes down to how many lands are in the opponent's hand, right? If they play a Saga and they have enough basics or enough other lands that they can't be mana denied off of the construct ability, the Collector Roof is not going to stop the constructs from coming. And a lot of these times, these Collector Roof decks might not have the best answers for constructs. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes, you're playing a Force of Vigor deck, you can answer constructs. You could play a Dress Down deck or something. You're playing, it depends on the deck. But Collector Roof is going to be extremely good against Saga if and when the Saga player doesn't have enough mana to activate constructs, because when the Saga goes away, it's going to make its 1 colorless mana, but then it's vanishing. You just lost one of your lands. And the card that you got off of your Saga does not have the ability to be activated. So you can't even get the mana fixing part of the Saga. And this isn't even just like a deck specific thing. You can play a PO deck where in one game, Saga will be very good against Oof, and then play another game where you just don't have enough lands for Saga to function, and then your Saga is a land with vanishing and it actually hurts you tremendously. It hurts you even more if someone is if they collector roof you, you've turned off the Moxen, and they wasteland your non-basic, non-saga land. Because then you've lost your colored land, and you've lost your ability to make constructs, and then your land goes away with the tutor. So I kind of want to just touch on that because it's something I see a lot in discussions of Collector Roof. Is people will say Collector Roof is bad versus Saga, and people will say Collector Roof is good versus Saga. And the answer is it actually just depends. It depends on both the deck, and it depends on the hand. Because a lot of these big blue decks are just like very dependent on using mana rocks as mana sources in the deck building. So they are cutting lands and playing mana rocks instead, and it just depends on what the hand looks like. Now, there are more things that you're going to stop the activated ability, but that's just like a way you can do it. You can either deny the ability to actually use it, or maybe you can deny the mana so that they don't have enough mana to activate their artifact, right? However, you can do another thing, which is interacting with the last ability of Saga. The card I want to point out the most here is Opposition Agent. Opposition Agent is a card that in Mox testing, I identified was the mirror breaker for a Tinker Saga mirror. This card, the constructs are you can deal with the constructs, but a lot of the time searching for a key, for a vault key, is going to be extremely hard for you to beat. The key, having the ability to make constructs unblockable and having the ability to go infinite, was really, really tough for these Saga mirrors. And we found that Opposition Agent is absolutely great against Saga decks. And it has a nice upside of being pretty good everywhere else. This is an A+ all-star role player against Doomsday. But it's also, you hit fetches. So you're hitting every blue deck. You're not going to have like the same success with this card against Bazaar or Workshop. But even against Workshop, they probably have a Saga. They might have a Golos. It's not a dead card by any means either. Not only do you stop the tutor ability, but you steal the tutor ability. And a lot of times you are a deck that is going to be able to use that ability, right? You're going to get any deck can use Black Lotus. So even if you're not looking for like a combo centric part of a Saga tutor, you can almost always get a mana rock, right? So that's a way I highly recommend dealing with Saga. Now you do need to be playing a deck that is going to be able to beat the constructs. That's kind of what makes Saga like really, really tricky, is that you can maybe stop part of it, but you need to be able to beat the other part, right? But I like Opposition Agent a lot. It's come up a lot as a way to attack Saga players. Also, a lot of times these Saga players are blue players, and a lot of times they're tutor players. They're going to play Mystical. They're going to play Vampiric. They're going to play Demonic. And you can steal one of those with an Opposition Agent. You can steal a fetch with Opposition Agent. It ends up being really strong. In this slide, I also included mitigation. Basically, you're not attacking Saga, but you are finding ways to live in the world with Saga. If you are playing a deck where you don't care about the tutor part of Saga, but you do have an issue maybe with the constructs, there are answers for that. My best and most favorite answer is Dress Down. Dress Down as a card that replaces itself and wipes the Saga tokens off the board at instant speed. It has great timing windows where you can get your opponent to invest 4 mana into, or I guess you could even say invest 6 mana, seeing as construct would normally be a mana source. So if they invest 6 mana into 2 creatures and you answer them with 1 card that draws you a card again, it's a very big win for you. Obviously, they still got to tutor, so your deck kind of has to be able to be okay with that part of it. But Dress Down is a really nice card because it's actually versatile. It's good against other things that are not Saga. It's good against like Thassa's Oracle. It's good against Collector Roof if you're playing a combo, a PO combo deck. You can do things to mitigate the effect of these constructs, if that's something you're worried about. So there's like a lot of ways, and you can definitely see with the cards that I've mentioned, these are cards that have all propped up in popularity in the last year and a half. Vigor decks, Vigor used to be more of a tool for Bazaar as a way to counter Graveyard Hate, Leyline of the Voids, Cages, Needles. Now you're actually seeing decks built around Vigor. You're looking at like the Luris, Deathrite Shaman, the Standstill-esque decks. I was playing a mono green Elves deck during the Saga era. I was playing a mono green Dark Depths deck. But because these decks are leaning so heavily on artifacts and Saga, you actually get to do things like, oh, I'm gonna main deck 3, 2, 3, 4 Vigors and use that as my way of interacting. A great example of that is Hogak. Hogak is not a deck with Forcible. Hogak is not even like an all-in graveyard combo deck. Hogak is somewhere in the more mid-rangey scale of things where its interaction is just 4 Vigors. That's basically it. It has some Besaiju's now, but 4 Vigors are its main form of interaction. And that's only really possible because of Saga, in my mind. I don't even know if Hogak reaches the same kind of metagame proficiency if Saga doesn't exist, which is really, really interesting. Hopefully that gives you like a good broad outlook of like how the decks are attacking Saga, where the weaknesses are of Saga. Saga is a format defining card, is a format warping card. But with all powerful cards, it has weaknesses and you can exploit them in your deck building, and you should be cognizant of its existence and put cards in your deck that are good against it. That's not the end of the slides I have about how to attack Saga, though. And the last slide is probably actually the most problematic of the slides, which is you can attack Saga by ignoring Saga. You've seen, at least in the past year or so, I think that the speed of Vintage has increased, and I actually think Saga is probably a meaningful part of that. Not because Saga is a fast card. A major weakness of Saga is the fact that it does not have an immediate effect. It's going to take turns for this card to do something. It's going to take mana for this card to do something, unless you're tutoring for Breach. Unless you're tutoring for Black Lotus for Breach. Like, to make constructs costs turns and mana. To make, to get to this tutor ability takes a long time. And it's easy for the power level of decks in Vintage to exploit this by not caring. Things like Doomsday, things like opposing Tinker decks, things like Pio. You've seen a huge rise in Oops All Spells in the last 3 months or so. And in my mind, these kind of decks are super strong against Saga. And the reason is because, well, I'm not trying to deal with the Saga. I don't really care that you played a land. No, now you have one less land that taps for Flusterstorm mana. You have one less land that taps for Pyroblast mana. If I just beat you before the Saga goes off, before you make constructs, before you before you search for your combo piece, then does your land really matter? And this is a sentiment that I think really I find in Pio and Oops All Spells. It doesn't exactly fit the Doomsday part of this, because I actually think that Saga decks typically have, like blue Saga decks typically have a decent matchup against Doomsday. And the reason is if you sequence your Flusterstorm mana first and then you play your Saga mana, you actually get to make constructs at instant speed while holding up Flusterstorm. So maybe Doomsday not the perfect example on this slide. It probably should have been, looking back now, probably should have been Pio and like Balustrade Spy or something like that. What I'm really trying to get at is that when I played a lot of Pio versus Tinker Saga matchup when I was testing for the mocks. And what I found was Saga was almost never a standout card in that matchup, because that's not what Saga is trying to do. Saga is an extremely strong card to beat grinding and reactive decks. And that's how I view Saga. Because when I'm playing Pio and my opponent plays a Saga, if my opponent invests mana into making constructs, even better. I want you to do whatever you want to do. If it's not killing me, I don't care. I'm going to try to kill you first. And that is a somewhat problematic mindset, right? And people would probably argue about, how healthy is that? Do we really want the format sped up like this? And it's interesting that the format is speeding up not because of a card that is enabling fast decks, but a card that is enabling slow decks, which I find very, very interesting. But it's just something to keep an eye on, because that's why I play a lot of Pio in this metagame. Well, I always play a lot of Pio. But it's why I recommend a lot of Pio to a lot of people, because I think you are in a perfect position to not play Sagas. In fact, when I did test like a Saga PO deck versus a Tinker Saga deck, like an Esper Tinker Saga deck, and I actually found that you wanted to cut Sagas from your PO deck to make sure you didn't have too many land drops, because you didn't really need Saga to do what you wanted to do in the matchup. The matchup almost never came down to having tokens on the board and attacking. It almost always came down to comboing. So that's, of course, just my subjective experience. But from the outside looking in, it does kind of feel like sometimes, depending on your deck, the best answer to deal with a Saga is to ignore the Saga. All right, enough about attacking the card. Let's just talk a little bit more about the card in general. I want to just cover a couple of like the more intricate things about Saga and its timing windows and its intricacies. If I miss any here, which I'm going to, feel free to write in the comments below different kind of tips and tricks about how to use Saga. One of the big things about Saga is its first ability, and all of its other abilities, I guess, are a trigger. So when you play Saga for the first time, it has no text, and a trigger goes on the stack, which will give it the ability to make mana. This means you have to be very precise in how you sequence your mana rocks and your Saga. If you need to make mana that turn, and your opponent has access to direct removal, like Force of Vigor, how you sequence is important. Especially if you think opponent has Force of Vigor, you might want to lead with your Saga. That way, all they can do to stop the trigger is to Vigor right away on one target. If you were to say, play a Mox and then play your Saga, they can, now they have a great window where they can Vigor your Mox and your Saga. You don't want that to happen. And this does kind of depend on like what's going on with the, what you're playing against, what spells you're playing around. Sometimes you want to hold your Saga to later, sometimes you want to play it earlier, but you just need to be cognizant of the fact that the trigger timing windows give your opponents opportunities to punish. So it's important when you play it in response to, and in regards to your other cards. Of course, this also can give you opportunities. One of the biggest ways it gives you an opportunity is its third ability is a tutor. And tutors come with a shuffle. So if you were to say, put this third ability on the stack after you've drawn a card per turn, cast a Brainstorm, wow, I can actually shuffle away 2 cards I don't want. There's a lot of things in Magic that are going to reward you for like putting cards back in your deck or shuffling your deck. If you need to do something of that variety, it can be pretty important. Another one that could come up is maybe what you want to do is use your top. And you want to draw a non-0 or 1 cost artifact. So you spin your top with the trigger on the stack, you draw the card you want, and now your top is back in your deck, so you can actually tutor your top back out and you didn't even lose it. Big things like that. One that frequently comes up is Needle, Pithing Needle. It is searchable out of Urza Saga, which means if you are on the opponent's side and you allow your opponent to resolve the search tutor ability, you do not have a timing window to do any more responses. They will put a Needle directly into play, naming whatever they'd like, and you don't have time to crack a fetch. Crack a fetch is the biggest one. But obviously, like activate a top, anything like that. Activate your Bazaar. You want to do that before the search ability starts. So it's going to go on the stack. They'll pass priority to you, and then you go, oh well, this Saga is resolving. I need to make sure I don't get my fetch land needled. You fetch in response. So just be aware that the timing windows for the search ability make for surprise. This is a Needle. That's kind of something that happens once or twice, and then you learn from it, but it's good to know ahead of time if it hasn't already happened to you. Like I said, that's just the big ones that came to mind when I was thinking about them. If you have any more advanced tips or tricks or anything like that, please feel free to leave it in the comments. I want to talk about some more specific things about Saga that come up. One of the big things is deck building tensions. Here I have 2 pictures for you. I have the mana base of Renee Randrup's big blue deck before Saga and the mana base that he plays now after Saga. And the thing I want to highlight here is that it's basically the same deck in its construction, but the mana is 2 larger, it's 14 to 16. And that kind of tension comes from the fact that Urza's Saga might be closer to Wasteland than to, a normal land. It's a spell land per se. It is a land that might not be producing you mana that you can use to cast your spells. Wasteland, a lot of the time, is just you use your land drop to Wasteland. It doesn't make you any mana. Saga is not exactly that, because it does get the ability to gain colorless mana. However, if it dies before you can gain colorless mana, it made you no mana. And if it lives and you don't have colorless, mana costs in your spells to pay for, then it's also not making you mana. So if your hand is 4 Preordains and you play a Saga, well, that's not the land that you need here. And so what ends up happening is, like, how do you count Saga in your mana base? Is Saga a land? Is Saga a spell? And the answer is it depends. It really depends on what's in your deck. For a lot of decks in Vintage, these Tinker Saga decks are counting it as about half. You'll see that they replace, 2 blue lands for 2 Sagas, and then they add 2 Sagas on top of that. And that's something you need to recognize, is that you just added 2 spells to your deck that count as a land drop, and you took out 2 blue sources that would cast your blue spells. I'm saying blue spells because typically we're talking about things like, I don't know, Preordained, Ancestral, Merchant Scroll, these kind of cards, right? I'm not pointing this out as, oh, I gotcha. This is, I'm pointing this out so you're aware when you're deck building what this is doing to your decks. One of the things I like to talk about is how, if you're adding 2 Sagas to your deck, you are technically putting 2 more bricks in your Citadel portfolio, as it were. You are making it more likely that your Citadel is going to break off. Now, is that a huge chance? No, but it is 2 more bricks, and it is a percentage chance that you are losing. You are losing maybe the ability to cast Flusterstorm, to cast Pyroblast, to cast Preordain, because 2 of your islands have now become colorless lands. These are things to be aware of. These are downsides. They are not, this is something that it's not going to prevent your deck from being good. Obviously, these decks are clearly still good, but they are going to produce more situations where your deck has trouble performing its intended goal. Just things to be aware of when you're deck building. I know this is not the case for every deck building. I know there was at least one Esper Saga deck. I think maybe Dom Harvey might have made it and played it at the time. Played Saga as 4 spells. Added 4 Sagas to the deck. Didn't cut any blue sources. That is not very typical. You're seeing some amount of blue sources being cut from these blue decks. So you got to be aware of, like, what spells are you making harder to cast because you put Saga in your deck, right? Now, the big one. This is the very big one. What is Saga doing to Vintage? And is that a good thing? Like I said multiple times in this video, Saga is format defining. It is that high of a power level card in Vintage. The thing to note is that there is always going to be high power level format defining cards in every format. Formats are going to be warped around cards that do the most things. Legacy is about Brainstorm. Vintage is about Bazaar. Vintage is now also about Tinker, right? The cards at the top of your format are always going to be what define your format and how decks are get built because of it. And what has happened since Saga has been printed is you have seen less of the blue controlling decks. Boomers will call these Xerox decks. Xerox is a term where boomers realized you can use cantrips to trim your land count. These decks are typically reactive in nature. They're not always reactive. You could technically say a Doomsday deck is a Xerox deck. So that's why I kind of don't like the term anymore. I don't really use the term anymore. I'm talking more about controlling Xerox decks. I'm talking about Jeskai. I'm talking about Rug. If you're new to Vintage, you might not know that for a long time, the blue-based Gush, controlling, cantrip decks were the best decks in the format. There were people calling for Preordain to be restricted. That's not the case anymore. These decks have actually been pushed out a lot because they don't have clean answers to Saga. Those decks always took a hit from Bazaar. They were always very bad against Bazaar, and they're bad against Saga for the same reasons. They don't have lands like Wasteland to effectively answer Saga and Bazaar. Now, That's not to say that they can't. These decks have started to adapt, and there are decks now that are more centered around Wasteland. And like the Xerox style decks that have Wastelands in them are the ones that are seeing play. So you are seeing these Rug Ren and 6 decks with Wastelands. You are seeing some Jeskai Luris decks with Wastelands. And I don't exactly count the Deathrite Shaman Luris decks, but they also are using like Wastelands and Vigors as ways to combat Saga. Those, like, when you start pushing into Deathrite Shaman territory, we're kind of talking about different decks. It gets a little muddy in the waters there. But basically, the controlling element of the format has been pushed out a little bit. Or maybe, actually, you would say a lot. I'll say a lot. The controlling element of the format has been pushed back because there's another land that is hard to deal with. I do still believe that these decks can fight Saga if they respect it as much as the other pillars, right? You have answers. You can play Wasteland. You can play Dress Down. You can play March. You can play Wear Tear. These are things you can play. Is it worth it? That's kind of an open question, right? People are like Thomas Mar are still working on these shells. So, you know, it's maybe a wait and see. But what happens is that those decks get pushed out a little bit, and some of the decks that get pushed forward are decks that ignore Saga. I'm thinking primarily about Oops All Spells here, but you could also say PO. PO hasn't really seen the super rise that I expect it should. I think it's one of the best decks in the format right now. The metagame data certainly seems that way, but it's not seeing a high play percentage. A lot of the Tinker pilots are still choosing to play other Tinker decks other than PO. But one of the big things is you've seen a huge increase in Oops All Spells. And Oops All Spells is a deck that does not give a crap about Saga. It does care if Saga goes off and Saga finds a graveyard hate card. But if your Oops All Spells deck is not won the game by turn 4 or turn 3, that's more the problem of the Oops All Spell than Saga, right? So decks that can ignore Saga are pushed forward. Decks that can't beat Saga with their normal tools are pushed backwards. And decks that have the best answers to Saga are also pushed forward. So these are the green decks. These are the Vigor decks. These are the Luris Deathrite Shaman decks that I'm talking about that really preyed on Saga for a while. You're seeing a large variety, really, in different decks that get to play Force of Vigor is the big thing. Decks that utilize Force of Vigor well get pushed forward. And really, is that a problem? Is this bad? Does this metagame consequences result in a worse format? Depends on what you enjoy. I personally really didn't like playing against Jeskai and all counterspell control decks because they were really annoying for me as a combo player. However, there are obviously players who are going to enjoy that kind of play style. And it probably should be present to some amount if you want to think of a quote-unquote healthy metagame that people will talk to. But Urza's Saga is not inherently, like a fast combo card. It's kind of, in my opinion, maybe this is off base. That could be off base. I'll leave it. It's a grindy card. It's a slow card. It's a card that is going to punish you for having a bunch of counterspells in your deck. And it's going to win over a couple turns. And it's a card that has a lot of, as we've seen today, weaknesses. It's got a lot of things you can attack. It's an interactive card, in my mind. At least in the scope of Vintage, per se. It seems like a more interactive card. So, it's kind of very debatable on whether that's a good thing the way this metagame trends. It's also worth noting that metagaming in Vintage is super cyclical. The only results you really get from Vintage are Magic Online tournaments, and what we can see over the past year and a half is that the decks ebb and flow, and as one deck becomes the best deck, there are decks that adapt and answer to it, and they become the best deck. We saw, like, even with inside of Saga decks, Esper Tinker for a while was the best deck in the format. It was metagamed and adjusted for, and it became an underperforming deck. There was definitely a couple months time where Esper Tinker decks were under 50% win rate. And this is a deck that was called for restrictions by some players, right? But now, as the metagame is shifting back away from Hogak, away from some of the cards that are good against it, you've seen some top 8s recently, four Esper Tinker players in a top 8 out of 5 or 6 pilots, right? So it is an ebb and flow, and there's so much going on in Vintage that most of the time, things that are strong don't stay on top for very long. So I think we'll just talk about that for a little while. I don't want to go super crazy, but I don't want to go super crazy in it. Is Urza Saga at the power level of being a restricted card in Vintage? No, but yes. Urza Saga is not the best unrestricted land. But some of the cards that are better than it are protected by the so-called, pillars of Vintage. We want to keep bazaars in the format. We want to keep workshops in the format. We want to keep Wasteland as answers to these things. It is definitely at its strongest in Vintage. It is shaping the metagame around it, but I wouldn't even say to the same degree as some of the other things that are happening. Like Bazaar is probably the biggest, monolith that is shaping things around it. Workshop less so these days. Saga has kind of almost taken that area from Workshop, which is really, really interesting. But something that we talk about a lot when in terms of ban restriction discussion is, what are your criteria for ban restriction? I will upfront tell you that I personally think bans and restrictions should be used in cases where a deck is overperforming for too long of a time and taking up. I don't even know about taking up mentioning. I have a different view of ban and restriction than most people. I think decks should only be nerfed and banned and restricted based on balance. And right now, there is no argument for Urza Saga to be restricted on balance reasons. The format is, in my opinion, looking at data from across the internet on all formats, Vintage may be one of the most balanced formats in all of Magic right now, which is absurd. I don't know how that's possible. And it might just be possible because it's underplayed, right? There's a certain amount of balance that is because the formats are underexplored and under deck building doesn't happen as much. However, other players, and this is not wrong, will look at ban and restriction discussion from other standpoints. They will look at it from standpoints of enjoyment. They will look at it from standpoints of interactivity. Are these decks fair? Or are people getting to do enough things that they enjoy? And there's certainly an argument there. You can absolutely make an argument that the power of Saga is pushing decks that are counterspell based, controlling decks out of the format. That's an argument you can make. It's not an argument I would agree with, right? Because I'm putting my brand restriction criteria based on balance. But if you are doing it on interactivity, or not interactivity per se, more for enjoyment per se, then yeah, that's totally a reasonable argument to make. For interactivity, I would say there's not a huge argument. I do think that Saga is a slow card with many windows of opportunity to interact, and also promotes interacting against your opponent. So it's making creatures, which you can kill, which not all combo decks or decks do that. Like I said, I think it's slow. There's so many windows, and I would say overall, I would put Urza Saga as a more interactive card than other powerful lands. Definitely more interactive card than something like a Workshop or a Bazaar, but obviously putting it in that company is definitely, maybe that's a little worrying. So from a balance perspective and an interaction perspective, I don't really see it. But from an enjoyment perspective, if that's something you care about, if you really want to make sure that people have access to these controlling counterspell-based decks, then yeah, that's totally reasonable. I would still say that these controlling and interactive-based decks can succeed in a Saga unrestricted format. I have been watching closely as players like Nox Tom have made these Jeskai controlling iterations with Wastelands in them, and I think that's a good direction to go. If it becomes to the point where the only way you can really make a controlling deck is with Force of Vigor, then maybe it becomes more of an issue. But I do think that the card pool in Vintage has enough available answers that are of enough high power level to create a balanced and interactive format, which I think both of those things are true right now. Obviously, there are decks that are not interactive that are popping up because of Saga, right? Like Oops All Spells, maybe. But even then, an Oops All Spells deck, interestingly enough, is a deck that is going to be super susceptible to the controlling counterspell deck. So maybe it's going to make enough meta adjustments that a controlling counterspell deck comes back if Oops becomes too much of the meta, right? Maybe that's why we actually saw some recent results from a Jeskai deck. This is kind of all speculative. You don't have a lot of concrete answers, but I want to just give you my perspective on the thing. Of course, I definitely understand and know that there are a lot of other people in a different camp on Urza Saga in terms of restriction. I will, of course, be happy to talk more in the comments. You can definitely comment why you think it should be restricted. That's kind of part of this discussion. But most of the main point, the main driving force of this video is that I wanted to show why is Urza Saga so good? What is Urza Saga actually doing to the format? And what are the answers? Because I've spent a lot of time thinking about the answers because that's what I do. I deck build. I want to make the best deck for any given tournament weekend. And it got me to the Pro Tour, right? Like that Oath of Druids deck, I would say, is objectively not good right now. I wouldn't play the deck or even something remotely similar to the deck. The reason that the Pernicious Deed Oath of Druids deck was so good for that tournament was because Saga decks were extremely high metagame share for that tournament, and they weren't really set up to beat the cards that I had put in as answers, which I think is really a healthy thing. I think these kind of cyclical, oh, I do this, okay, then I'm going to try to do this, and then, oh, we're going to next level, go to the next level. Those are things that make Magic really fun and Magic really interesting to me. And I just want to talk about it because clearly I've already spent a long time talking about it, and it's an interesting card, and it's a powerful card. It's a format defining card, and I'm sure this is not going to be the end of it. I hope you enjoyed this content. Definitely a new one for me. If you like this kind of content, let me know in the comments. Maybe we'll do more dissections and analysis of different things and different forces in the Vintage Metagame in the future. New gameplay videos, as always, Monday, Wednesday, Friday on this channel, 11 a.m. Eastern. I'll see you then.